Hi, this is John the Rosenhead, the Jerusalem psychotherapist. In this week's Torah and Psychology post at Pashas Kisave, we read about the event at Ha-Eval and Ha-Grizim, where the Bnei Yisrael were split between the two mountains, and the blessings and the curses were called out or read out to them. And what is prominent in the Psukim is how the Bnei Yisrael, in response to hearing the blessings and the curses, responded Amen. That this is a communication that was interacting between the Levium that were reading out and were telling the blessed, going through the laws, basically, of what the Bnei Yisrael need to do in order to avoid klalos, in order to receive bracha. And they responded Amen to each one. And what Rav Soloveitchik asks on this is that if we apply the principle, the halachic principle of Shomer Ka'ona, that if you listen to something, it's as if you, without actually responding, without actually verbalizing anything, if you intend with the kavanah to listen, then that is as if you have spoken, and it's as if you have said the words that need to be recited. So in this case of Ha-Eval and Ha-Grizim, we can ask why is it so prominent in the Psukim that the Bnei Yisrael had to say Amen? If we apply the principle of Shomer Ka'ona, which according to the Rambam, if you have kavanah to be yotze, that you have kavanah, that you are focusing on what is being said, on what is taking place, you don't necessarily have to say anything. And the Rambam actually says you don't necessarily have to say Amen. You can just listen, and that would be enough. So what Soloveitchik says is that the case of Ha-Eval and Ha-Grizim is different in the sense that it was a communal act. It was a communal event where the Bnei Yisrael were entering into a communal contract to take upon themselves and to accept this basically agreement of fulfilling and following what the Torah says in order to receive bracha or to avoid receiving klala. This is, by saying Amen, it is a communal declaration of agreement, of entering into this contract, and therefore it's not that it was on every single individual as a separate entity. And therefore, maybe you could say Shomer Ka'ona, that people could be just silent and have the kavanah and concentration to accept the brachas and klalos and to accept the contract. This required as an entity, as a united entity, that the Bnei Yisrael as a whole were accepting, and therefore it required everyone to actually commit and say Amen. And this was, in a sense, testimony and acceptance of the whole of Am Yisrael, which required actual and verbal declaration, which constitutes this joint or united entering into the contract as a whole, with the whole of Am Yisrael. If it's a separate individual, and he's talking about the individual's connection with or verbalization and concentration and focus, which functions through Shomer Ka'ona, that's one thing. But if it's talking about an entire communal act, you can't have some people being silent. We don't know what that means. We can't necessarily infer from the silence of the individuals or from everybody that there is a collective agreement. It requires the Amen. That's what Soloveitchik is saying in Ha-Eval and Ha-Grizim. If we take this explanation, and also with the Rambam, of how Shomer Ka'ona can work, that if you really have a focus, if an individual has the focus to be yotze, they don't necessarily have to say Amen. This gives us an indication of psychologically how Shomer Ka'ona can work, and in particular if we apply it to the idea of active listening in therapy. When a person comes to therapy, the therapist wants to listen, and importantly, wants to empathize with what the other person is saying, what the other person is expressing, the emotions that they are discussing. And the role of the therapist is to connect with, to join with, empathetically with what the person is expressing. And sometimes that actually simply requires active listening and Shomer Ka'ona, that sometimes all the therapist needs to do is to be silent and to listen. And that is enough. We don't want the situation to turn into an interaction where the therapist is identifying or is overly identifying with the patient or with the client, what they're expressing, to the extent that they feel it's now their emotion, that it's now their struggle as well. Sometimes you want to be able to hold this separation, this divide between the therapist and between the client. You want to empathize, you want to listen, be silent, maybe to say amen even, instead of like giving a one-word response, or giving some sort of indication that you're following, that you're listening, and that you're understanding. But we don't want the situation to turn into that it's as if the client and the therapist are together and fused within the emotion, that the client and the therapist are actually feeling the same thing. Empathy as a tool, it allows the therapist to enter into the situation, to listen and to respond and to connect, and it's as if they're expressing, obviously, feelings of concern and worry, and maybe that can be transmitted in silence. But if we take the ha'eval and ha'grizim, in a sense, when there's a communal situation and everyone needs to be involved, and the therapist needs to enter and maybe needs to be actively involved and to be expressing and talking, sometimes that can actually overstep the boundary, overstep the mark, where suddenly the therapist is talking too much, where the therapist is expressing their own opinions too much, where their verbalization is not actually therapeutic, it's not helpful, it's actually a fusion, and it's over-identification, where it's as if the therapist is also saying, well, this is my problem, I'm also with you with this problem to the extent that it's my problem as well. That becomes maladaptive. That actually oversteps the mark in terms of what the role of the therapist is. So if we want the therapist, as a therapist, if they want to use shomer ka'ena, if they want to use active listening in a therapeutic way, they need to understand that it's still the individual, and through empathy they are connecting with the client and with their struggles, and they're able to express some sort of a connection, but to understand that it's not a collective experience, it's not their own experience to the extent that they overly identify, similar to ha'eval and ha'grizim, that it is a collective experience. So this gives us an insight into how to empathize, how to listen in a therapeutic way, in an adaptive way, but not to turn it into a collective over-identification. Have a good Shabbos and keep well.